Hey everybody. Somebody asked me a great question a couple weeks ago. They said, if Jesus were here in the flesh today, what would he say about Donald Trump? And at first I thought, well, who am I to speculate on what Jesus might say about Donald Trump? So I said something careful like, well, we want to be careful how we talk about this. Jesus would probably have bigger fish to fry. And he might say something like, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But it bothered me that I didn't have a better answer to that. So I thought about it some more, and I realized I don't have to speculate. Jesus did warn his followers directly about the same sorts of dangers that Donald Trump and his MAGA movement pose to believers today. And during his lifetime, Jesus dealt with his own Trump-like political figure, and it turns out that he had plenty to say about him. And based on how Jesus warned his followers about this leader, I'm confident that he would oppose the way that Christians have allowed Donald Trump to use them as his main power base. And he would warn Christians today to beware of the way the MAGA movement is poisoning the Christian faith. So who is this Trump-like ruler that Jesus warned his followers about? It wasn't the emperor. Caesar ruled over a huge empire, but he used local rulers to carry out his rule. And it's not Pontius Pilate, the local Roman official that Caesar placed over Judea, which included Jerusalem. Jesus eventually did make his way to Jerusalem, and he died there at the hands of Pontius Pilate, but he wasn't from that area. Jesus came from Galilee, and he performed most of his early ministry in Galilee and the surrounding regions. And Caesar had placed Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch, to rule over that region. His father, Herod the Great, had ruled over a much larger kingdom, including Judea. And Herod the Great was the Herod in the Bible who ordered the murder of all the baby boys around the time that Jesus was born because of a prophecy that a new king of the Jews would be born. But when Herod the Great died, Caesar Augustus divided his kingdom into 4 portions and put Herod Antipas in charge of the portion that included Galilee. So that's why he was called Herod the Tetrarch, because he only ruled one of 4 portions of his father's kingdom. So Herod Antipas isn't the Herod who ordered the slaughter of the innocents, but he is the Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded. And it turns out that Jesus talked about Herod Antipas, and Jesus even met Herod just before he was crucified. So we don't have to speculate about what Jesus would say about Herod. And one of the things that Jesus said appears in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. It reads, "Be careful," Jesus warned them, his disciples. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." So what is this yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod? To understand this, we have to look at a little bit of the history of the politics of Jesus' day. Now, the reason that I want to be careful not to speculate on what Jesus might say about Donald Trump is because I have what I think is a healthy bias against injecting politics into my study of the Bible. But when we understand the world Jesus lived in, it's clear that politics played a major role in the issues surrounding his ministry. And many of the things he spoke about involved his thoughts on some of the social and political divides among his fellow Jews. And of course, Galilee and Judea under Roman rule could never be called democracy, but politics happens in every human society. It just looks different depending on the system. And politics mattered in Galilee and Judea. And what we see is that Jesus did not concern himself with winning the political game of his day. And he didn't side with any of the competing factions. But he warned against the damage it does to the conscience of his followers to align themselves with some of those factions and to take on the world view of those factions. He specifically warned against aligning with Herod. Again, because of the damage that it would do to his people's conscience, the damage it would do to the gospel message. And of course, that resonates with someone like me. Donald Trump has given me, just simply as a human being and as an American, numerous reasons to oppose him. But the reason that I'm speaking out as a Christian against Trump is because the damage that he's doing to the conscience of his followers, his Christian followers, is immense. It's stunning to realize that without the 80% approval that Trump gets from white evangelicals, he'd be nothing politically. The reason the nation, the reason the world has a Donald Trump problem is because Christians have a Donald Trump problem. And it's a problem that Jesus understood because it's grounded in tribalism. It's grounded in our willingness to support some of the most unjust leaders in the world if those leaders promise to do their injustice on behalf of our tribe. And as a first century Jew, Jesus knew all about tribal politics. The Roman Empire had kept Jesus' people under its thumb for generations, and within Jesus' tribe, they had many different responses to Roman rule. And they divided up into factions over the best way to approach life and religion and politics as Jews under Roman rule. We can learn a lot about how Jesus approached the dangers of politics by the way that he talked about these factions that he encountered. And the two factions that are most important to this discussion today are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, I just want to give a word of warning about this. When I talk about these groups, I'm looking at them only through the lens of what Jesus said about them at one point in time and for a certain purpose. It's a mistake to look at the accusations that Jesus made against the Pharisees, for instance, and to make pronouncements for all time based on his critiques. Yes, he did shout things at them like, "Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites!" But that was meant to be a stinging rebuke for that time, for a specific purpose. Christians who talk about this stuff need to be careful not to misapply those statements 2,000 years later about an entire group of people. In the same way that I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years and I'm criticizing white evangelicals, so Jesus was criticizing some of the movements of his time from within the tribe. I'm pretty careful about how I talk about white evangelicals. I say things like 80% supported Trump in the last two elections, but I'm careful not to paint with too broad of a brush. But if I were operating in the sort of prophetic mold that Jesus was, if I'm, for instance, standing outside the Target Center, watching a bunch of white people with crosses around their necks filing in to attend a Trump hate rally, I might shout something like, "Woe to you, white evangelicals, hypocrites." And I would hope that if someone played a video of me doing that 100 years from now, they wouldn't think I'm condemning everything about white evangelicals for all time. I would hope that they'd understand that I'm expressing some grief and some anger from within the Christian movement at a direction that these people are going, and I'm trying to wake them up. So, having said that, we'll talk about the Pharisees and Sadducees a bit here. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were both involved in governing their people in Jerusalem, but the Sadducees had more official power during the time of Jesus. The Sadducees ran the temple, and they had more votes in the Sanhedrin, that was their ruling council, than the Pharisees had. But the Pharisees wielded a lot of cultural power. They tended to have the support of the masses. So the Sadducees had to work with the Pharisees despite their differences. In like really overly simplistic terms, the Sadducees represented wealth and political power. And the political system under Rome worked pretty well for them. So they found it to be in their interests to keep the relationship with the Roman authorities on an even keel. And that leads me to one of the big cultural differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Before the Romans ruled that region, The Greeks had been there, and they influenced the region with Greek culture. It's why the New Testament is written in Greek. So the Pharisees were all about purifying the nation, calling the people back to honoring the Mosaic law. As much as possible, they rejected what they saw as the worldly Greek influence on the culture. They believed that the reason they were in exile in the first place was that the nation had been unfaithful to God and his law. So they wanted to repair the relationship with God by helping their people to return to pure worship of God through the Mosaic law. They wanted to see the Davidic kingdom reinstated, not to be ruled by Rome and certainly not by the Herods. They thought that the most important step in making Israel great again was to perfect their religious observances. And so the tension between Jesus and the Pharisees revolved around the systems that the Pharisees put in place to help keep the nation pure. Jesus accused them of hypocrisy because he said that their systems focused on outward behavior while leaving the heart untouched. But he didn't reject their basic desire to uphold the Mosaic law. So for the purposes of this talk, I just want to oversimplify and point out that for the Pharisees, the solution to their problem of being under the thumb of the Romans was religious. They wanted to see the Davidic kingdom reestablished. And toward that end, they wanted the nation to please God by becoming that holy, called out people that he created them to be. Now, the Sadducees, though, on the other hand, they had taken on a lot more of the Greek influence and beliefs than the Pharisees had. They rejected many of the religious beliefs of the Pharisees, and they seemed more concerned with worldly power than with upholding the purity of the nation. So where the Pharisees saw religion as a solution to the nation's problems, the way the Sadducees hoped to make Israel great again was to suck up to worldly power and influence. So then we've got Herod Antipas. The history of the Herods and Judaism is complicated, but it's safe to say that in general, whatever kind of Judaism the individual Herods may have practiced, they mixed it with a strong dose of Greek culture. And Herod Antipas fit that bill. He seems to have practiced some level of Judaism, maybe just as a way of appeasing the people he ruled. We don't know for sure, but he was basically a secular ruler and a very worldly man. So Herod Antipas and the Sadducees shared some things in common. They both held some level of political power within the Jewish world, but it was worldly power granted to them by a pagan emperor, and they both practiced a worldly religion, very much influenced by Greek thought and practices. Herod, much more so, of course, but they shared that worldliness, that pursuit of wealth and power, and the rejection of the strict religion and the holy life that the Pharisees tried to practice. So back to this passage from Mark. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So what does this mean? First of all, when Jesus talks about yeast, or leaven, depending on the translation, he usually means something harmful. He does use it positively to refer to the kingdom of God growing like yeast, but it usually represents a contaminant, something that comes in and spreads rot. And that's what he means in this case, since he's warning against it. What's interesting is that we have this account of Jesus' words in 3 different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the writers have him say it slightly differently in each account. In Luke 12, it says, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, 'Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees,' which is hypocrisy." He doesn't mention Herod in this account, just the Pharisees. And in Matthew 16, we get the fullest discussion from Jesus about what he means. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And the disciples don't get it. They think he's ripping on them because they didn't bring enough bread. So he says, How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So isn't that interesting? In one account, he only mentions the Pharisees, but in one, he mentions the Sadducees, and in the other, he mentions Herod. So why did Matthew render Jesus' words as the yeast of the Sadducees, and Mark rendered them the yeast of Herod? I think it's because in both narratives, Jesus is contrasting two ways of approaching life as a Jew under Roman rule, two ways of approaching building the kingdom of God, and he's saying that both of them lead to error. He explains himself regarding the yeast of the Pharisees. He's using the Pharisees to represent a legalistic, hyper-religious approach to life that seems like it's going to lead to holiness, but instead, he says it leads to hypocrisy because it doesn't get at the issues of the heart. But for today, I'm focusing on the yeast of the Sadducees, or the yeast of Herod. And like I said earlier, what the Sadducees and Herod have in common is worldliness, a worldly belief system, a worldly lifestyle, and a worldly approach to power. The New Testament also mentions the Herodians, who may have been even further down the track of making Israel great again by throwing their allegiance completely behind Herod. But whether Jesus is referring specifically to the Herodians in Mark's account or to the general idea of seeking after worldly political power by attaching yourself to people like Herod, he identifies this approach as a yeast that's being introduced into the gospel of the kingdom. So, seeking after worldly power in the hopes that that's going to somehow usher in the kingdom of God is a contaminant, and it's going to poison the message of the gospel. So, of course, we see that now with the MAGA movement. The reason that I've reluctantly had to start deleting some of the comments that I receive on this channel is because some people who call themselves Christians have made this decision. They've chosen to throw in with a worldly leader, not just to vote for him, but to link their faith to their support for him. And their belief system has been poisoned, sometimes to the point where they go onto social media and make comments that illustrate just how deep the poison has gone. When a person starts believing that God has chosen to work through this one man and his MAGA movement, and that this movement represents the last hope against the evils of the other side, then you've got a contaminated stew going. And it's harmful enough to equate one political party or movement with God and to claim that the other side is anti-God. But when the leader of the supposedly pro-God party exudes every attribute that Christians are supposed to flee from, then something has gone deeply wrong in the belief system of the people who support him. Some yeast has come in, and it's spreading toxins throughout the movement. So the reason I bring all this up is to counter the notion that Jesus would have stayed completely out of politics. These were the political issues of his day that he was addressing. And the specific warnings about allegiance to Herod and the worldly approach to life and power that Herod and the Sadducees represented are applicable to the MAGA movement right now. Donald Trump and the various leaders of the MAGA movement have very little outwardly that you could do that you could call them Christians. And most of their Christian supporters know that. What Trump and the other MAGA leaders offer to their supporters is power, worldly power. And the Christian statements they make are just like this little dance that they have to do in order to buy off the conscience of their supporters. But it turns out that in his day, Jesus refused to play this game with Herod Antipas. Here's an account from Luke chapter 13 of how Jesus talked about Herod's power. It reads, "At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, 'Leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you.' And he replied, 'Go tell that fox, I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal. In any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. And then he laments over Jerusalem. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Now, I could spend an hour on this, but I'll just point this out. Jesus called Herod a fox, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. Jesus didn't say, oh, I'm a religious leader, so I shouldn't comment on the ruling authorities. No, he called Herod a fox. Jesus tells his followers here that he's going to ignore the warnings about Herod and just keep doing his mission. And he's going to press on to Jerusalem because that's where he's going to go to die. Then he laments over Jerusalem, and he says that he longs to gather Jerusalem's children together like a mother hen does under her wings. That's how a leader ought to care for his people. But he calls Herod a fox. A fox attacks the mother hen and kills and eats the chickens. So you can't get much more critical of a political leader than that, to say you've not only failed as a protector of your people, but you've become the one that they must be protected from. So yeah, Jesus publicly criticized the main political leader over the region where he lived. And one more thing, once Jesus made it to Jerusalem and was arrested, just before he was crucified, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who was being asked to put him to death, realized that Herod was in Jerusalem for the feast. And he saw that this might be a way out, a way that Pilate could get out of this politically risky act of judging Jesus. He sends Jesus to Herod because since Jesus is from Galilee, Herod has authority over him. And the charge against Jesus is that he claimed to be the king of the Jews. So here he is appearing before the guy who sort of holds something like that position at the time. And this is what happens. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he'd been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Now, isn't this interesting? On the one hand, Jesus posed enough of a threat to Herod that at least a rumor had been floating around that Herod wanted to kill him. But Herod was also fascinated by the stories that he'd heard about Jesus. He wanted him to show off for him, to perform a sign for him. And I don't know what would have happened if Jesus had done that, but here's my guess. I think Herod would have made Jesus part of his court, and he'd trot him out for people to watch him do his miracles. Herod would have used Jesus to build his influence with the Jews. Maybe he'd give speeches where he'd say, hey, have you seen my Jesus? Where's my Jesus? There he is. Stand up, Jesus. Great guy, does lots of miracles. Let me tell you, from Nazareth, can you believe it? But eventually, the relationship would sour, and Herod would start calling him Jesus Sanctimonious, and that'd be the end of that. But anyway, Jesus didn't take that bait. He remained completely silent. So here he is, standing in front of the man who could use his political power to save him from his fate, and he says, not a word. What more of an indictment of Herod's worldly power could Jesus give him than to not even recognize him with a word? I wish that that's what Christian leaders would do when Donald Trump tries to win them over to his side. If every Christian leader simply met him with silence, it'd speak volumes, and I wouldn't have to make videos like this. But they don't. Too many have allowed their thinking to be poisoned by the yeast of Herod, the desire for worldly power and aligning themselves with the worldliest of leaders. And now we're seeing the rotten loaf that produces. So thanks for listening.